This week in the Regency, we're starting a new series, Regency Personalities. Now, obviously, the royal family is part of that kind of Regency celebrity personality thing, but we've got a whole playlist about them. So if you want to know more about the Prince Regent, you can go over there and have a look, or his wife, Princess Caroline of Brunswick, who is my favourite. But now we're going to talk about people who were famous in their own time. And some of those will be in society, like Lady Jersey. Some of them will be like the patronesses of Almax, for example, we might have a look at. Some of them might be in the theatre or the circus, or just really rich and influential, like Mr. Coke of Norfolk. So the first of those, of course, we have to start with the personality of the greatest impact, and that was Beau Brummell. Let's have a look at where we're jumping off from. It's the Morning Post of the 20th of November, 1814, and it's about fashionable arrivals. I love that little fashionable world thing at the top. And there's a whole list of people. Notably, a lot of them don't have titles. So a lot of people who are considered fashionable were not necessarily of the nobility. There are a lot of misters, captains, and even Sir William Guy's there, Bart, which means baronet. He's technically not a nobleman. So there's a whole list of them, and it tells you where they live. All the way down, lots and lots of people. And in the middle, we see Mr. George Brummell in South Audley Street. Unfortunately, where he lived is gone. So his name was George, not Beau. Beau was a nickname. And he's credited with single-handedly changing men's fashion for the worse, in my opinion. By taking all the colour and fun out of it. Now that was it was the end of what they call the Great Male Renunciation, where men's clothing got more and more boring over about a century. That was really sped up by the French Revolution, where people went, maybe we better not look like we're rich when we're walking down the street. Women, of course, ladies didn't walk down the street much, so they were allowed to keep frocking up. But men often, men generally speaking in Europe became less extravagant, I think, in their dress. And George Brummell, Beau Brummell, was the person who put the final nail in that coffin and made it fashionable to be very plain, that masculinity was somehow linked to sobriety of clothing, which I think is a real shame. You know, poor boys, they're not allowed to dress in anything interesting, particularly if they're going into business. However, let's look at where he comes from and why he had such an influence on this world, because he wasn't rich and he wasn't noble. So where did this influence come from? Well, let's start with both his father and his grandfather. This is his father, William Brummell, a man who eventually became the High Sheriff of Berkshire, but who started out as a confectioner's son. His father, also William, had a confectioner's shop, and they took boarders in to make some more money. And there was a little card put in the window of the confectioner's shop saying that a room was available. And a man named Charles Jenkinson, now I don't know if this story is true. I really hope it's true because I love it, but it may not be true. But a man called Charles Jenkinson, who eventually became the first Earl of Liverpool and eventually became a very important person in the government, he was attracted to the note, the little placard, because it was so beautifully written. The calligraphy was so perfect. And this placard was written by Brummell's father, William. So at this point, he's only 10 or 11. He's the son of the shop owner. And he apparently had really beautiful handwriting. So much so that Charles Jenkinson decided to employ him as a scribe, as the word is amanuensis, that is somebody who writes on your behalf, someone who takes dictation from you. And so William Brummell worked directly for Charles Jenkinson at home, like taking notes and writing up reports and things like that. And when he was old enough, Charles Jenkinson, who was becoming increasingly important, got him a job in the public service, sorry, the civil service, as it is known in Britain. And William Brummell was clearly a very, very intelligent man, as indeed his son Beau was. And he rose to become the private secretary of the Prime Minister. He started in Treasury, that was where he got a job, courtesy of Jenkinson. And he went all the way up the ranks to the highest possible position of private secretary to the Prime Minister, who was at that point Lord North. And he married Mary, also quite clever, who was the daughter of the person who ran the lotteries office. So he really married up. And what all this meant is that Beau Brummell was actually born in Downing Street, possibly at actually number 10, because the family would have had chambers there, so he was always on call for the Prime Minister. But if not at number 10, then next door. And it's clear that William Brummell had intended his sons to be gentlemen. Here he is with his brother. George is the younger one. So cute. And the fact that he even had portraits done and portraits of his children done show that he had in mind the idea that they were gentlefolk now. It was a big step up from the confectioner's shop to the private secretary of the Prime Minister, but he hadn't grown up as a gentleman, but he was determined his children would. And so he sent the boys to Eton, where apparently even then George Beau was very kind of concentrated on how one looked and changed how you wore the white stock that boys at Eton wear, the neckcloth. And he went from there to Oxford, to Oriel College. He only stayed a year. Apparently he was getting into trouble there. And he went from there to here. This is not him. I wish we don't have any images of him in uniform, which I think is a real shame. But it shows you the uniform he would have worn as a young officer in the 10th Light Dragoons, which also later on became the 10th Royal Hussars. And the point about this is that this was the Prince Regent's own regiment. So he was the patron of the regiment. He was the top officer in it. And that meant that he came to the messes, to the formal dinners that the regiment had, where everybody got dressed up in formal uniform and got drunk, basically. And that's where the Prince Regent met George. He met Beau, as he was already known by then, I think, at the dinners at the regiment mess. And apparently he was very witty, he was very sharp, he was very, think of the kind of wittiness of Oscar Wilde, but not as languid. And he really impressed Prinny, really, really impressed. And this is well before he's the Prince Regent. He's just the Prince of Wales at this point. And they became really good friends, which allowed George Beau to get away with so much stuff. Right? If you were the friend of the Prince Regent, you were in the innermost circle. And that meant that when he left the army, already in debt, quite significant debt, he was immediately accepted into society at a level that his father could only dream of. We don't have very many images of him from that period. This is one. We can see the importance of the neckcloth. I prefer to call it a neckcloth rather than a cravat because I think cravats are narrower and smaller. They sit smaller. But the neckcloth, the side whiskers, the air of haughty disdain, and also the sort of slightly long hair. All of these things combine to give him this kind of this sense that I can judge you. And he did. He judged a lot, but he made it funny. So he was very much a leader of fashion. This is the kind of classic Brummell. And he was regarded eventually as a kind of judge of gentlemanship. This is after his death in 1840, where this article about what does it mean to be a gentleman. We know it has puzzled very clever men to tell what a gentleman is. Beau Brummell declared it to consist in the use of clean linen, country washing, and plenty of it. And by linen, he meant the neckcloth and the shirt. Remembering that linen is, when we talk about women and we talk about linen, we're often talking about underclothing, including drawers, but men didn't wear them under those kinds of breeches. If you look here, there's no visible panty line because they're not there. In fact, the shirts were pulled down and tugged under, which made it a lot easier to go to the toilet, I guess. So linen is the shirt and the neckcloth really is what he's talking about. This is a kind of classic Brummell, 1805, the height of his popularity. We have surprisingly few images of him from this period. I expected there to be a lot of cartoons. You know, I have shown you in the royals section lots of cartoons that were made of the royal family, particularly of Prinny. But I thought there would be lots of Beau Brummell as well because he was a friend of his, but no. And I can only assume that people liked him and they didn't want to make fun of him, possibly because he wasn't rich. A lot of questions have been asked about why Prinny made a favourite of him. And on the one hand, we have he was very funny, he was very impressive, he was incredibly intelligent, you know, all of those things. And on the other hand, we have a rumour, possibly set about by the Brummells themselves, that he was this man's grandson. Who was he? He was Prince Frederick, the Prince of Wales, brother of George III. Now, to go back to our English history, the man who became George III, that's the Mad King, he was in fact the second son. And Prince Frederick was his older brother who died before their father did. And so George became the king. And it was put about that the confectioner had been cuckolded by this man, given, you know, the way they that family spread their seed around. It wouldn't be surprising. But anyway, it was so that would have made them second cousins. So whether we believe that or not, entirely up to us. But it would explain a little bit about why he was accepted, because princes' bastards generally were far more acceptable to society than other people. So what happened to him? Well, this is where it takes a turn for the dark, and I'm sorry, the rest of it is not fun. So if you just want to leave him on a high, he's not rich, he's never rich, but he has the favor of the Prince Regent. He's the darling of society. He's invited everywhere. He's a member of the appropriate clubs. He's at the top of his game at this point. And then he falls out of favor. And the question is why? There are no contemporary images. I don't want to show you images that are just made up by people after he died. But basically, there was a party and the Prince Regent was there, and Brummell insulted him and his friend, the Regent's friend. And the Prince Regent withdrew his favour. Now, that didn't mean Brummell was out of society. He was still invited to everywhere the Prince Regent didn't go, which was quite a lot. But what it did mean is that his creditors started going, well, nobody's going to pay off those debts, are they? And the debts were enormous. So we basically have almost like a fabulist. He's living as though he's incredibly rich. He's keeping up with the Joneses when the Joneses were all very, very, very rich people. He's in particular horses. He gambles at ridiculous levels. He owes a lot of money to a lot of people. He never pays his tailor's bill. But, that one I reckon you can let go, because that tailor got a lot of work as a consequence of him supplying Beau Brummell, But but basically the walls start to close in on him. He has something like more than £500,000 in debt at that point, which is like, the fact that people let him get to that is just mind-blowing to me. And it must mean that they expected somebody else to settle his debts, not the Prince Regent, because the Prince Regent was also in debt. So who knows? But he just was in so much debt. He was a gambler and he raced and all this kind of stuff. And the clothes, of course. And he also bought a lot of like silver plate, gold plate, a lot of stuff for his rooms. Just a ridiculous amount of things, and mostly experiential things like gambling. So he runs away to France and lives in Calais, which, because it was originally owned by the English, had an English population there, and there was a consul there, English consul. And eventually he got a job at the consulate. And then he does something equally stupid to insulting the Prince Regent, and he writes to the Home Office and says, I think you should close it. I think you should close this consulate down. Which they do. And now apparently he hoped that when that was closed, they'd give him a better job somewhere else like Paris. But no, they just closed the consulate down. And so he was left penniless. He was put in debtor's prison. Some friends in England got him out of that. And he dies effectively in a madhouse. And this is where it gets very sad. He dies in 1840, in March of 1840, at Le Bon Sauveur Asylum on the outskirts of Caen. And we know that he dies of syphilis. Now, he has now married. We don't know what his sex life was like. We have no idea. Honestly, we don't. I looked. So we don't know where he caught the syphilis from, or indeed how many people he spread it to. But given his extravagance and lavishness and self-indulgence on every other level of his life, one can only assume he spread it far and wide. One of the things we know about syphilis is that in its tertiary stage, which comes a few years before you die, it makes you reckless in all sorts of ways. And so with that in mind, when we look back at this insult to the Prince Regent and this idea of, well, you should close the consulate, looking at it from a medical perspective, we can see that maybe those decisions were made by the illness rather than by the very, very clever man who had found himself a good position in society pretty much by his own efforts. Not to say anything bad about his father who gave him the push up, but and I think this is sad. He had been living on the charity of friends. He had a pretty sad life at the end, and he certainly died an unpleasant and horrible death. However, I do believe that he would be absolutely delighted at the fact that his name lives on as a synonym for the ultimate dandy, a man who really cares about his appearance, someone who had had a positive effect, what he would think of as a positive effect on male dress, and who remains part of the language of people even today, and a character who is in many ways much beloved, and certainly I think the greatest, one of the greatest at least, of the Regency personalities, closely followed by Lord Byron, whom we will talk about in the next Regency personalities. So farewell to George Brummell. It's a sad ending, but it was a great story. That's this week in the Regency. If you have a Regency personality that you'd like me to do a rundown on, let me know. I'll see you next week in the Regency.